Good afternoon, everybody. Today, I'm going to present to you an overview of my capstone project, in which I'll be focused on advancing equitable coastal adaptation, specifically in the San Francisco Bay region. So everyone listening to this presentation is aware that the climate is changing due to increased greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. As we emit more greenhouse gases, the atmosphere warms, causing glaciers to melt and the volume of water to expand, increasing sea levels worldwide. And while global sea levels will inevitably rise, coastal areas around the world will be hit differently. So according to the working group of the California Ocean Protection Council Science Advisory Team, which actually includes UC Santa Cruz's very own Gary Griggs, it is projected that there is a 67% likelihood that San Francisco's sea levels will rise 33 to 41 inches by 2100, depending on different climate scenarios. So how will this affect the approximately 8 million inhabitants that reside in the San Francisco Bay Area? This slide features a GIF made from the Bay Conservation Development Commission's Adapting to Rising Tides Shoreline Explorer, where all of the parts flashing in blue will actually be flooded in a 36-inch sea level rise scenario plus king tides. So the darker the blue you see on that flashing image there, the deeper the flood. And the impacts of sea level rise can mean more frequent flooding events, longer flooding events, permanent inundation, which basically means a state of being permanently submerged underwater, shoreline erosion, and contamination of fresh groundwater with high salinity seawater. With this in mind, regional governments have begun to act to adapt our shorelines to sea level rise. However, the people that will most likely bear the brunt of sea level rise's impacts are frontline and vulnerable communities, and these communities are often least involved in the planning process. So I just wanted to take a step back. There's a lot of terms flying around. What are exactly frontline and vulnerable communities, and how do we define them? For the purposes of my capstone in this presentation, frontline communities experience the first and the worst consequences of climate change. Vulnerable communities have high exposure to hazardous impacts, high sensitivity to sea level rise as a stressor. For example, how disruptive it is to vital infrastructure on which a large proportion of the community is dependent upon, and low resilience, or the ability to withstand and recover from difficult times while meeting basic needs like food, clean water, and shelter. With these communities in mind, coastal adaptation needs to understand and prioritize the needs of people with the most at stake. Adaptation projects should not only prioritize and strive for social equity in its implementation, but also in its process. So I'll just talk about equity, and I know Kalina defined equity in her presentation, but I would also like to define it for this presentation's purposes. Social equity means that everyone, including frontline and vulnerable communities, should have fair access to livelihood, education, and resources, as well as full participation in the political and cultural life of the community, and self-determination in meeting fundamental needs. So often when people think about social equity, they think of it as a kind of static end state to be achieved. For example, the emphasis on the fair access to livelihood, education, and resources. But I challenge everyone here listening to think of equity as also a dynamic and iterative process. Social equity is both a means and an end. And the reason I emphasize frontline and vulnerable communities as well as social equity is because it is important to situate the current challenge of sea level rise in the context of a larger social and geographical history. Historically, the power to shape our environment has lain in the hands of a very small percentage of people. For decades, planning has been an extremely technical, circuitous, and exclusionary process, or what one might call insider baseball. Redlining was a discriminatory planning practice in which services were withheld from potential customers that resided in neighborhoods classified as quote unquote hazardous to investment. Due to these historic policies, redline neighborhoods have significant numbers of racial and ethnic minorities and low-income residents who now in the Bay Area and in metropolitan areas across the United States often have to deal with environmental injustices, such as disproportionately high exposure to contaminants in the air and water when compared to communities that were not classified as quote unquote hazardous to investment. These neighborhoods are often on or near the sites of working waterfronts and have defined the frontline and vulnerable communities considered or to face the first and the worst of sea level rise today and to the future. So it's important to better understand the priorities and concerns of frontline and vulnerable communities. And governments need equitable and inclusive engagement practices that not only invite these communities to the planning table today and into the future, but also possibly to collaborate and even defer to them when necessary. The Movement Strategy Center has created a very useful resource for governments called the Spectrum of Community Engagement, the Spectrum of Community Engagement to Ownership, which is pictured here. Basically, the spectrum shows the many stages of relationships between governments and communities. So historically, many government stances towards community has been to ignore or to inform. However, many regional and local governments today are moving up the spectrum to consult and involve. Through increased engagement and active participation, projects in frontline and vulnerable communities may fare even more successfully due to ownership and buy-in. To achieve this, the relationship between communities and government needs a radical shift towards inclusivity at the local and the regional level. So through increased engagement and active participation, coastal adaptation projects in frontline and vulnerable communities may do even better without having engaged them in the first place. And frontline and vulnerable communities, I just want to acknowledge this, have already been innovating in bringing accessible, environmentally justice-focused curriculum and programming to their constituents that prepares them to engage civically to engage civically and in the planning process. So governments must be prepared to support, listen to, and collaborate them too. Community-based nonprofits have already begun to address this critical need by building their own communities' capacities. So going clockwise from the upper left, we can see the Oakland Shoreline Leadership Academy in session, to the leaders of Nuestra Casa's Environmental Justice Parent Academy based in East Palo Alto, to Shore Up Marin residents investigating flooding in Marin City. My capstone project focuses specifically on advancing equitable coastal adaptation between government agencies and frontline vulnerable communities in the San Francisco Bay. My capstone partners were the UC Intercampus Climate Resilience and Adaptation Initiative, a research project led by Dr. Borja Reguero, and the San Francisco Estuary Partnership, a branch of the National Estuary Program and housed under the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and Association of Bay Area Governments, serving the greater San Francisco Bay Area. So the first step of my capstone plan was really to understand what's going on at the city and the county level when it comes to sea level rise adaptation preparedness. For the UC Intercampus Climate Resilience and Adaptation Initiative, I conducted a landscape analysis of adaptation planning of 101 municipalities, 9 counties, and various unincorporated territories, and confirmed that sea level rise resilience and preparedness are indeed extremely disparate in the San Francisco Bay Area, much like most of the state of California. This is a huge problem in sea level rise planning because sea level rise knows no jurisdictional boundaries, and a coordinated regional approach could greatly reduce unintended consequences and greatly enhance and amplify local efforts. Enter the 2022 blueprint. Over the past year at the San Francisco Estuary Partnership, I've had the privilege of supporting the update of this regional roadmap that has incorporated the input of over 200 stakeholders across government, academia, nonprofits, and private entities. In the 2022 Estuary Blueprint, also known as the Comprehensive Conservation Management Plan, I've authored equity-centered actions and considerations for all 25 actions outlined to be carried out over the next 5 years for a healthier, more resilient San Francisco estuary. Up until this 2022 update, equity and other quote-unquote human dimensions have not been included in the scope of the Estuary Blueprint. So similar to what Kalina was saying, kind of a slow kind of acknowledgement that humans and environment are indeed not siloed from each other and that they do have an effect upon each other. In this iteration of the blueprint, I've supported the writing of the equity-focused action, which explicitly outlines milestones to be achieved by 2027, such as 20 capacity building projects for community-based organizations, a community-based organization directory and map, and more. Creating an action explicitly addressing equity through specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound milestones will be important in holding collaborator partners accountable to more inclusive practices and lead to more equitable governance models and project outcomes. The blueprint is used to coordinate a regional approach to the restoration, adaptation, and conservation of the San Francisco estuary, and can be used as a policy and funding tool for the next 5 years until the next blueprint update. I want to emphasize that I did not do this work alone. The blueprint is, of course, a consensus-based regional plan with over 200 stakeholders. But while the Estuary Blueprint has always been the result of collaborative efforts by regional and local governments, state agencies, and nonprofits, it has never been a very equitable or inclusive process due to a lack of direct public involvement in consultations with tribes, tribal organizations, and community-based organizations, often serving and vulnerable communities. The 2022 Estuary Blueprint is the first time that public feedback and dialogue has been encouraged through listening sessions and early consultations with such entities. In January, I planned and hosted the Blueprint's first ever public input session, where community-based organizations, tribal leaders, and members of the public were invited to comment on the Blueprint and talk to key authors of the Blueprint directly. This is a big step in a larger incremental shift on the spectrum of community engagement towards community ownership, participation, and democratic process in the restoration, protection, and adaptation of the San Francisco estuary. This year's public input session also sets the stage for increased transparency in collaboration with the general public in blueprints moving forward. Before I finish presenting my capstone project, I would just like to share some lessons learned from this past year. I've learned that collaboration is time-consuming, but essential to an equitable process. Also, I've ground-truthed the concept presented early on in this presentation, the concept of the spectrum of community engagement to ownership. Engagement, especially collaboration, is not a black and white concept. A big lesson that I've learned in collaborating with so many different stakeholders is that it is important to know when to ask for feedback and how much, so as to keep processes moving forward and efficient as possible. Finally, from this past year, I've learned that facilitating a collaborative process is a valuable skill in and to itself. It requires both long-term and short-term planning, open lines of communication, transparency, and an acknowledgement that relationships are central to this work and require a lot of time and invested resources to build and maintain trust. Without prioritizing such relationships, any type of regional collaboration would be near impossible. In terms of next steps, as I finish my capstone year, this work is far from done. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, I see equity as an ongoing and iterative process, not an end state to be achieved. Facilitating equitable coastal adaptation means investing in equity and inclusivity. Relationships take time, money, and resources. It's important to remember, it's important to remember that relationships take time, money, and resources. I'll say it again. Thanks to bipartisan infrastructure law funding and donations from generous anonymous donors, SFEP will be receiving approximately $1 million in funding over 5 years from the EPA, specifically to build capacity internally and externally, advance underfunded or unfunded blueprint tasks, and leverage other fund sources, as well as directing funds externally to support climate adaptation planning and implementation, developing and implementing programmatic approaches for advancing equity, outreach, and communications. I, along with Senior Project Manager Heidi Nutters, will also be pursuing a water quality improvement fund for the implementation of the Palo Alto Horizontal Levee Project, which will also involve tribal stewards and monitors and engage frontline and underserved communities in the Palo Alto and East Palo Alto area in monitoring the social and ecological impacts of this pilot horizontal levee. Needless to say, I will have my hands full after graduation, and I'm very much looking forward to building upon my capstone work in the next phase of my career. Last but not least, I want to thank everyone that has helped me complete my capstone this past academic year. Thank you to Dr. Borja Reguero of the UC Climate Resilience and Adaptation Initiative for the opportunity to contribute to your team's work and research. Thank you to James Moeller and Caitlin Sweeney at the San Francisco Estuary Partnership for always supporting the advancement of my capstone and my academic pursuits. And to my faculty advisors, Christy Croker and Lindsay Dillon, for offering robust support and guidance when I needed it. That's it.